Thank you. Good morning. My name is Zahr. I teach at University of Washington School of Law. My talk today is about the lay observer perspective and the way that I view it as a label that masks the work that is being done by judges and juries, and it's a particular kind of reading work. There are tests, the ordinary observer test, there are perspectives sort of built into tests, but in almost all the circuits, in almost all of the infringement analysis, with respect to substantial similarity in non-literal infringement cases, the lay perspective comes in to do some work. The problem is, the work it does is really unclear, and sometimes it's very unclear within a given circuit whether the lay perspective is sort of a proxy for market harm, which is language that you see people find in Arnstein and kind of replay in subsequent cases. Sometimes the work it does is to serve as a kind of heuristic for how we know, so it's an epistemological device, right? We know that infringement has happened because we look through the lay observer's eyes and this is how they would see it, therefore we know it's happened. So that's sort of a different thing. Sometimes it just appears to be a legal tool to reach or avoid the jury of the kind that we see all the time in early tort cases, right? Sort of a struggle over decisional allocation, or rather the allocation of decisional power. Sometimes it seems like a fig leaf to just reach a particular outcome, and sometimes it's almost insulting how glancingly it's mentioned as a judge then will sort of pretend that he or she is speaking in the lay observer's voice and proceed to just deliver an opinion. My project is interested in how these various different functions behind this kind of label of the lay observer play out, and whether if we were to more robustly conceptualize what copyright's reading practices are, whether we can kind of bring some coherence to substantial similarity analysis. And if you look at some of the critiques of substantial similarity analysis, a lot of them line up with problems around expert evidence, or the confusing first step and second step, or cognitive biases that juries understandably suffer because of the order of analysis and so forth. So it's my belief that if we turn to a theory of response that's developed elsewhere, some of the humanities, we'll be able to talk more about copyright's reading practices and come up with some prescriptions. Now I cite this language in Arnstein v. Porter because it's so often thought to be the origin of the ordinary observer test. Now we know that there were references in the 1870s in design patent law, and even to some extent in copyright law, whether it was reasonable or average, some form of a lay perspective gets referenced. But Arnstein is the case that so many circuits cite to when they're talking about the importance of the lay observer, even though 2 years before this there was a California case that Croft cites along with Arnstein, right? So this perspective predates Arnstein, and yet Arnstein is the case that seems to develop, or rather deliver, the most punch. And we'll hear from Sean tomorrow about maybe some theories for why that is. In my view, Arnstein is this case that that courts read what they want into it, right? So they read into what they want to get out of it. For Croft, no surprise, Arnstein is all about idea expression, right? You see it right there. For Dawson, it's all about the intended audience and market harm. So it seems to me to be something, sort of a kind of text that subsequent courts can interpret in a very malleable fashion. Okay. My article draws on insights from read-response theory to propose a slightly different, and by different I mean different, allocation of work. It's actually funny because the word efferent is going to show up a bunch in this talk, so we'll come back to that. But a slightly different allocation of work between judge and jury, so really more for the judge, less for the jury. An expanded role for expert testimony to assist in the infringement analysis, and more accurate assessment of what it is, the kind of work that juries do, what they can do, and also what they should do. And I want to debunk this notion that there's a kind of visceral, spontaneous, these are the language, the words that you see in the copyright. This is a visceral, spontaneous response to the works that they are confronted with in copyright cases. Now, because it seems to me that the status of the lay perspective is so conceptually unclear and really under-theorized, I am just starting to develop a theory of the lay observer by using some insights from reader response. Now, reader response many of you are familiar with. There hasn't been a ton of engagement with reader response theory in intellectual property scholarship. There's been some. Laura Heyman's the kind of forerunner in many ways, and her work has been about fair use to some extent, and then also she writes on product label warnings, a really cool piece, but less so about substantial similarity analysis. I think there's some room to do kind of a deeper dive than our collective scholarship has done so far. What's interesting is that the kind of heyday of this movement was in the 60s and 70s, and the first one I turned to first started writing in 1938. She's this incredible woman, Louise Rosenblatt, whose work was really overlooked, and her publications spanned from 38 to 78. She just kept teaching literature and writing in literature that entire time. This woman who died at 101, roommates in college with Margaret Mead, just like this fascinating personality who somehow has kind of stayed off to the side, a little bit forgotten about. But anyhow, I find her take on reader response really helpful because a lot of the excesses associated with reader response, namely that either the author communicates and anything that the author is doing, one must sort of fall in line with and become the ideal reader or a resistant reader, right? It's a very author-centered view. That's sort of an excess. The text controls, right? This is another view where, you know, the text is the one doing all the work. So yes, the reader makes it happen, but subject entirely to the text's controls. And then lastly, the reader controls, where radical text is indeterminate and any text can mean anything, and the only constraints are with the interpretive communities in which the texts are read, right? And that's a sort of dismaying approach when one thinks that in fact there are some readings that are really bad, right? You can read Hamlet and think that it's a play about witches, and no, that's the wrong play, right? That's not the right reading for Hamlet. It's not in the text. That's your association, and it's wrong. So Rosenblatt's theory is appealing because she comes up with the idea of a transaction between the reader and the text, and it's kind of a negotiation. It's a space in which the reader activates the meaning, but subject to the text's cues and constraints. She's highly phenomenological. It's actually cool. The intro to 5th edition of her 1978 piece features an introduction by Wayne Booth, a really noted scholar, and actually on the, yeah, there he is, one of the reader response theorists, who says, you know, it's actually kind of embarrassing how the Academy has overlooked her. And this is radically interdisciplinary work. It's philosophical, it's psychological, it's phenomenological. She studied under Dewey. You know, she's just really an incredibly well-read person, and yet very grounded. I do have a total brain crush on her, so if you hear that kind of breathlessness, I'm sorry. You know, maybe a few months from now I'll be over it. But so she has this view that the text constrains readers to some extent, but that within the responses to cues and constraints within text, there's a range of possible readings. And a very sophisticated or expert or advanced reader will just have more meaningful experiences and sort of respond to more cues or follow more cues. But that any experience within the response is to some extent valid. So this is kind of one valuable thing that she proposes, is that it's outside both the reader and the text. And then another thing she does is she separates the kinds of readings, and this is one of the key ways I think she can be helpful to copyright law. And let me just say one last thing about her, which is that there's a ton of reader response theory that's highly psychoanalytical. It's all about like projective fantasies and like how if you read it. I just don't think that will fly in the legal academy. I don't think it will be helpful for judges. I don't think that courts are interested in like projective fantasies and the id and the ego. Her stuff is based on 40 years of teaching literature in classrooms. So it's actually, at some points, explicitly empirical, and at other times, it's based on practical experiences of what happens when you set texts loose and ask people to read them. So it's really grounded and practical, and perhaps explains why it was overlooked, right, in part by the Academy. It was pedagogy, not so exciting, you know, until really the late, until really the 80s. Even in the 80s, there are a lot of texts that overlook her. Okay, so I'll tell you about her two types of reading, but I'd like to ask you to do a thought experiment first. I'm going to ask you to read the work on the next slide for your own subjective experience with the work. I'm going to give you a minute to look at it. Don't think about analyzing it or understanding it. Just experience it. Just pay attention to your responses as you're experiencing it. And I have a handout of it for those of you who can't see the screen or who would like to look at it up close.
Yay, party game.
It's a party game, right? It's phenomenology. You kind of can't experience the different kinds of reading through my telling you about them in print or out loud. So here you go. It's a poem by Adrian Rich.
We need some up front.
That's probably enough time for just one straight reading all the way through. I'm going to point out to you that your experience so far has been subjective. It's been kind of what you know, what you bring to bear. Maybe you know something about Adrienne Rich, maybe you don't, doesn't matter. I've told you it was a poem. The form kind of announced that it was a poem, so you know that you're experiencing it in one particular way, subjective and personal. There's no one ideal reading, right? There isn't somebody in this room who got it right. There are some wrong readings, right? If you're seeing that this is a poem about shipwrecks, you're wrong, right? If you're seeing that this is a poem about natural disasters, you're wrong. You may know that there's some metaphor going on. You may see that there's, right, a plane, turbulence. You understand that there are different registers, literal and metaphorical. You may have no idea what the metaphor stands for. Some of you in the room are like, I got it. Some of you are like, I don't know, and it would take a couple more readings. It doesn't matter, but you see that that's happening, right? You're aware that there's something going on there. Okay. Now, I'd like to ask you to revisit the poem from a different posture. Here's some information for you. This is a poem that uses airplane turbulence as a metaphor for emotional ups and downs. There's an allusion to the work of Gerard Manley Hopkins, and you'll hear in that piece some sounds from his work. For those of you who experienced a kind of turbulence in the language when it shifted from something kind of straightforward like airplane instructions to something weirder sounding and a little bit more rot, maybe archaic, that might help you explain that. I can tell you that Rich's work often uses some kind of a complex metaphor for the process of managing emotions, such as grief, loss, love, and anger. I can tell you she's a highly respected poet, and that she intentionally drew on Hopkins' work because it was one of the so-called terrible sonnets, which he wrote when he was extremely depressed and was using poetry as a way to just sort of survive. It was a very private, angst-ridden time in his life, and she knew that. Now I'd like to just ask you, take a look at the poem again, and I'll go back to it on the slide. How many references to turbulence or air travel can you find? How many instances of language repetitions can you find? And I'll take you back. And go. Give like 30, 40 seconds, a little exercise. Okay, we'll focus back together. As you might have guessed, you all win. It doesn't matter how many you got. I was just drawing your attention to what happens when you read in a different way, when you read instrumentally, when you read what Louise Rosenblatt calls efferently. So she's got a number of different contributions. One of them is that the reader engages with the text, and I've explained that a little, and I'll come back to it. Another is that the text contains cues and constraints, which differs from the fish version of like all text can mean anything. Depending, constrained, it's true, I'm being a little bit fast and loose, and we can fist fight during the Q&A.
I want to see that.
Pardon?
I want to see that.
I used to teach Kung Fu, so you do want to see that. Okay. Then, the reader works from one of two different modes. Rosenblatt says there are two different stances with which readers read. So when a mom sees that her child has, this is one of her examples, sees that her child has ingested poison, and she picks up the poison bottle, she does not care about the assonance and the imagery and the sound and the shape of the warning label. She is trying to get the maximum amount of information as quickly as she can for a particular purpose, right? She actually uses legal text as the quintessential example, or one of them, of using something instrumentally for a particular purpose. How do these differ? Oh, and let me just point out, aesthetic stance does not mean anything to do with Weinstein, right? She's using aesthetic in a phenomenological sense of experience, a lived experience writing. So let's just not even talk about that whole Weinstein thing. Okay, so here were your two readings. Some version of this happened. First, you encountered the poem in some subjective, private, affective, phenomenological way. Now maybe you were kind of waiting, because the artificial nature of this exercise, for what it was going to mean, right? For what we were going to do with it, and that's fine. Still, you didn't have some purpose. You didn't have a multiple choice test that would have converted your reading to affective, looking for something, right? This is an experience that unfolds through time. It is not visceral. It takes a moment, and I'll just demonstrate that in just a sec. It's concerned with what you experience during the reading. It varies based on your knowledge and background. There's no one correct reading, but there are incorrect ones. Then your stance shifted. You went to an efferent stance. This is a stance in which you read, at least in theory, objectively. It's more of a public, in other words, three people can all read and be sort of sharing their experience. It's informational. You could say it's functionalist. She chooses not to use the word instrumental, but if I say instrumental, you'll understand what I mean by that. You can proceed quickly. You can skim. I gave you less time the second time around. It's really concerned with what remains after the reading, to be borne away. Efferent, right, from the Latin, to bear something away. That's what we do in law, right? In theory, any reader can receive full information so long as equipped with sufficient guidance. In your first reading, if I were to say, what was your general impression of the poem? You would have some response. If I were to say, for instance, what was your total concept and feel of that poem, right? I'm leading a little bit, right? But you have a holistic impression. In your second reading, you have a more deceptive, right? Sort of more particularized, detailed, and less holistic impression. And I want to use this distinction that she creates in order to lift the hood of copyright's reading practice and say, look, there are particular times when actually we're reading efforently, we should acknowledge it, and we should allow expert evidence. We should acknowledge that sometimes just having an instrumental reading in which we have to pull information out, such as through abstraction, filtration, comparison, or such as through the extrinsic or dissective analysis, the various circuits call it different things, right? That's an effort mode. Let's acknowledge it. And let's not confuse things by also throwing the affective, aesthetic, holistic into it. Let's cabin that. There may be a place for that in copyright law, but it's in that holistic sort of, it's a different element, not sort of the same kind of reading. Okay, lastly, I just want to say that in terms of being an active reader and making meaning, I just want to point out in a single line what this means, because sometimes people think that it means something, you know, pache healed, that it means something radical, like I can make any meaning I want out of it, right? That's the cartoon version of reader response theory, and it's also just like, I want to make clear I'm not endorsing. You read the poem, and the first line says, there will be turbulence, right? Turbulence, there will be turbulence, you'll drop. And if you stopped at that first line, you would understand yourself to be being told by somebody, perhaps on a plane, you are going to drop, right? So it creates a sense of, I'm going to drop. And then the very next line, which is intransitive, the very next line shows you that actually it's transitive. It makes you correct your understanding of what the word drop is doing, and it shows you that drop takes a direct object. You'll drop your book before the water ball instead, which changes the meaning. And in order for that to happen, you have to correct as you're reading, just on the most basic level, right? So you're doing active reading. And this is just one little example to show that when we're asking anybody to do even the holistic, intrinsic, subjective, personal reading of the aesthetic mode, we're asking them to make active choices. It's not some visceral gut thing. I can't look at the poem and know what it says, right? I've got to engage with it. I've got to make it mean something. So let's not pretend that there's something kind of visceral and easy to do that juries do. Now, for time reasons, I'm going to skip by this, but I'll just point out, you can come up with pretty quickly things that if you're in an efferent stance might assist your reading, and you can take certain things away as you read it efferently that can be affected by something like expert evidence or guidance or you know, that are different from the mode when you're just experiencing it as a phenomenological thing. Okay, the payoff, well, I would like to be able to use Rosenblatt to show that copyright's reading practices lie on a continuum from efferent to aesthetic. Most are efferent. You might think, if you didn't know copyright law, that all would be efferent. And yet, we have, since Roth and before it, but really Roth kind of, maybe unfortunately, makes a bigger deal of it, we have this space for aesthetic reading, where we ask jurors or fact finders to consider the work kind of holistically and in a different way. And so I have some prescriptions that come from this, and I guess I'll just kind of leave them up and turn to questions since I've only got 3 minutes left. Jake.
So I love this, and yet, if what you're trying to do is put more authority in the jury's hands, I worry that from an institutional competence perspective, I trust judges to do this better than 12 people who would rather be watching Matlock. And I know that shorts juries to a certain extent, but this strikes me as complicated on a level that I would have a hard time, for example, kind of explaining to my father, who is kind of my prototypical mental jurist. You're a jury?
Yes.
Jury member, so help me.
Right. Okay, so one, I don't want this to go to juries, but I don't think that I get to say that. I think that, you know, and the last piece I wrote, I sort of said, let's try to do as much as a matter of law in this area as we can. But since Arnstein, right, there seems to be, and oddly, given Judge Frank and his use of juries, or resistance to juries generally, there seems to be a kind of entrenchment around use of juries. So to the extent that we're going to use juries, what I'd like to do is cabin what they're doing, acknowledge what it is, take away the ability to just say, blah, visceral, gut, this is what it is, without kind of engaging in some explanation of it. And in terms of explaining to your dad, yeah, I mean, you read the jury instructions, and Wendy Gordon, it was just the tip of the iceberg, her piece on what was wrong with the jury instructions in the Floyd Lyons litigation, right? There's multiple things. It is really hard to do. But I somehow think if you were to do something similar to what I said and just read it and kind of walk through what you're experiencing and why, right? Like Rosenblatt's insight was to shift attention away from purely the text to the reader, to how are you experiencing what's going on, subject to the textual evidence in front of you. Right? You don't get to just say, I'm experiencing, Hamlet as Macbeth. You have to say, I'm experiencing Hamlet in these ways as I'm reading it. I do want to say one other really quick thing, which is that the paper opens with a song, a painting, and a text, a poem. I'm using a poem here because it's easier to do quickly than if I were forced to listen to music. But this is generalizable to other media. Just want to make that clear. Fall.
No, I don't want to argue about Stan. I have a really simple question. So all the reader response stuff, the discussion is about how do we determine meaning, right? It's about what the poem means, and we're talking about different approaches to determining meaning. And that's not what we're asking either jurors or judges to do in these kind of cases. They're not trying to determine the meaning of the work before them. In fact, meaning isn't protected. They're trying to judge substantial similarity or something like that. And to me, that's a different task than it is to determine meaning. So I'm just wondering how what the connection is between the reader response, which I think is really valuable, but how does it sort of map onto that different task?
I struggle with this because I think the effort mode of reading is not very much to figure out a deeper meaning. It's purely to kind of get through the work. It's like, what is in there that I need to take away? And I think if you're going to try to figure out things like idea expression, you actually have to make the work, you have to, she calls it evoking the text. You've got to evoke the text sufficiently to be able to figure out what it is, right? And whether that's running it, as a film and watching it in time, or whether that's reading it and putting the cues together in your brain, or listening, sort of filtering through what's happening. It's a form of meaning making that I think is different from, kind of taking an interpretation into a symbolic register and sort of building lots of things on it. It's really meaning at the very basic level. It's like the meaning of you'll drop your boat to hold your water bottle steady, right? It's like just on the barest level of what does this thing do, rather than like meaning with a capital N in some interpretive fashion. Does that make sense? Let's keep talking.
Thank you.
Run out of time.